The door to the Graves family home closed with the sound of a coffin lid shutting. It was a solid, final sound that echoed the closing of Ilara's life in the town of Promise Creek. On the other side of that heavy oak, her father-in-law, Mr. Graves, stood with the town's other patriarchs, his duty to his dead son formally concluded. On this side, Ilara stood alone on the porch, the biting November wind pulling at the thin wool of her mourning dress. She was 22, she was a widow, and she was an outcast. In her left hand, she clutched the entirety of her inheritance. It was not the partnership in the town mercantile her husband Thomas had been promised. It was not a small home to see her through the winter. It was 20 silver dollars, counted out with cold precision, and a deed. The paper was dry and brittle, the ink faded. It granted her sole ownership of a single, worthless parcel of land miles north of town, the claim known as the Widow's Hole. The name was a cruel joke long before she inherited it. It was a failed mineshaft, the one that had taken Thomas from her. A support beam had cracked, and the mountain had shrugged, burying him and 2 other men under 1,000 tons of granite and shale. Mr. Graves had called his son's venture a fool's errand from the start, a distraction from the family's more respectable businesses. In his grief, that judgment had hardened into a weapon, and he aimed it squarely at Ilara. He saw her not as a grieving widow, but as the living embodiment of his son's final, fatal mistake. Kicking her out with the deed to the grave itself was a public declaration. She was no longer a Graves. She was nothing. She looked down at the coins in her palm. They felt cold and useless. The deed felt like a death sentence. The collected eyes of Promise Creek watched her from behind curtains and through the windows of the general store. She saw Mr. Finch, the store owner, shake his head with a look of profound pity. She saw Brant, the town's most successful trapper, lean against a post and grin, a private joke passing between him and his cronies. They all expected her to break. They expected tears. They expected her to take the evening stagecoach east, to disappear into the charity of some distant, unknown relative. Instead, Ilara straightened her shoulders. The wind cut like a knife, but she felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. Grief was a hollow ache in her chest, but beneath it, something else was taking root. A stubborn, silent refusal to be erased. She walked down the porch steps, her boots making no sound on the dusty street. She did not look at the stagecoach office. She did not look at the church. She walked directly to Finch's Mercantile, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful, inappropriate jingle. Mr. Finch hurried from behind the counter, his face a mask of practiced sympathy. "Ilara, my dear girl," he began, his voice soft. "A terrible business. A terrible, terrible business. If there's anything you need, a ticket, a letter sent—" He trailed off, seeing the look in her eyes. It was not the look of a victim. "I need a good axe," she said. Her voice was steady, devoid of emotion. "A felling axe, with a solid haft, and a shovel, the best one you have." Finch blinked. "An axe? Child, what would you need—" "And rope," she continued, placing 3 of the silver dollars on the counter. 50 feet, and a sack of salt." The store fell silent. Brant, who had followed her in, let out a low chuckle. "Going to salt the earth where your husband fell, girl? Might be the only sensible thing to do with that worthless rock pile." Ilara did not look at him. She met Mr. Finch's eyes, her gaze unwavering. He saw the resolve there, hard and unyielding as granite. He sighed, the pity in his eyes turning to a kind of resigned sorrow. He knew what she intended to do. He thought it was madness. He took her money and brought the items to the counter: a gleaming new axe, a heavy spade with a thick oak handle, a coil of thick rope, and a heavy burlap sack of salt. The purchase took almost all the money she had left. She hefted the supplies. They were heavy, an anchor pulling her toward a future she could not yet imagine. She turned and walked out of the store, the bell marking her departure. She did not look back at the faces in the window. She did not look back at the town that had been her home. She squared her shoulders against the weight of the tools and the biting wind, and began the long walk north, toward the land that everyone in Promise Creek knew was worthless. She was walking toward her husband's tomb, with the intention of making it her home. The journey was a punishment. Each step took her further from the known world, from the thin comfort of roads and fences. The land grew harsher, the trees thinning out to reveal the stark, gray bones of the mountains. The axe and shovel dug into her shoulders, and the weight of her meager belongings felt immense. She walked for hours, the sun a pale disk in a sky the color of dishwater. The wind was a constant companion, whispering of failure, of the coming winter, of the foolishness of her errand. By late afternoon, she arrived. The claim was exactly as she remembered it from the awful day they had retrieved the bodies. It was a scar on the face of a massive granite cliff, a chaotic jumble of shattered rock, splintered timbers, and raw, overturned earth where the entrance to the mine had once been. The collapse had been total. It was not a mine shaft anymore. It was a grave, a pile of rubble at the foot of an impassive stone giant. The sight of it broke through her cold resolve. A wave of despair, thick and suffocating, washed over her. Her knees buckled, and she slid to the ground, the tools clattering beside her. The town was right. Mr. Graves was right. Brant was right. This was a place of death. There was nothing here. The wind howled around the cliff face, its voice full of mockery. Tears finally came, hot and stinging against her cold skin. She wept for Thomas, for the life they were supposed to have, and for the utter hopelessness of her situation. She had traded everything for a pile of rocks. She stayed there for a long time, huddled against the cold ground as the light began to fail. The despair was so deep it became its own kind of numbness. Eventually, the cold seeped through her dress, forcing her to move. She crawled on her hands and knees toward the base of the cliff, seeking some small shelter from the relentless wind. She pressed her back against the sheer rock face, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to conserve what little warmth she had left. And then she felt it. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first. A subtle difference in the stone. Through the thin fabric of her dress, the granite beneath her right shoulder blade was not cold. It was warm. Not hot, but a steady, persistent warmth that felt like a sleeping animal. She pressed her palm flat against the rock. It was unmistakable. A deep, resonant heat emanated from the stone itself. Her breath caught in her throat. She shifted, running her hands along the rock face. Most of it was icy cold, but she found a vertical fissure, no wider than her hand, from which this gentle warmth seeped. It was a geothermal vent, a deep breath from the Earth's heart. Thomas had spoken of them, of miners following warm seams deep underground, but she had never imagined one so close to the surface. As she knelt there, her ear close to the rock, she heard another sound, nearly lost beneath the cry of the wind, a slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of water, clean and steady, coming from somewhere deep within the collapsed shaft. It was not a flood. It was a spring, sheltered from the surface, protected from the coming freeze. Warmth. Water. The two most essential elements for life, hidden within a place everyone considered a tomb. The despair that had crippled her moments before receded, replaced by a surge of something fierce and elemental. It was not hope, not yet. It was something harder. It was a plan. The town had given her a grave to die in. She would turn it into a fortress. The first week was an exercise in pure, brutal labor. Ilara's body, accustomed to the work of a home and a garden, was not prepared for this. She worked from the first gray light of dawn until her muscles screamed and her hands were raw. Her goal was not to reopen the mine. That was impossible and foolish. Her goal was to build into the collapse, to use the unyielding cliff face as the back wall of a home. She started with a shovel, moving tons of smaller rock and scree, clearing a level space against the cliff. Her hands, soft and pale, were soon a mass of blisters. The blisters broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. She learned to ignore the pain, to focus only on the rhythm of the work. Dig, lift, throw, repeat. The pile of discarded rock grew into a barrier, a low wall that gave her a small measure of protection from the wind. Next came the axe. In the sparse woods nearby, she felled lodgepole pines, trees no thicker than her thigh. The shock of the axe biting into wood traveled up her arms, jarring her teeth. The first tree took her half a day to bring down. By the end of the week, she could fell one in an hour. She learned to read the lean of the tree, to make her cuts clean and efficient. Then came the harder work of limbing the trunks and hauling the logs back to her cleared space. She used the rope, her own dwindling strength, and sheer, stubborn will to drag them, one by one, across the rocky ground. She began to build the walls of her shelter, a small, square room pressed against the granite. She notched the logs with her axe, fitting them together as best she could. The work was clumsy, the gaps wide, but it was a structure. It had shape. She used the largest, flattest stones from the collapse to build a foundation and to fill the larger gaps between the logs. She found a deposit of clay near the hidden spring's overflow, and she mixed it with water and dry grass to create a thick, sticky mortar. She plastered it into every crack and crevice, chinking the walls against the wind. Her world shrank to the physical reality of stone, wood, and mud. Inside this nascent structure, she focused on her two greatest assets. She carefully cleared the rock around the geothermal fissure, exposing more of the warm stone. This became her hearth, a natural fireplace that required no wood to produce heat. The granite itself was a massive thermal battery, absorbing the earth's heat and radiating it into her small room. She discovered a second, smaller fissure higher up the cliff face, and with painstaking work, she cleared a narrow channel to it. It became her chimney, drawing the smoke from her small cooking fires up and away, venting it so subtly that it was nearly invisible from any distance. Her second system was water. She followed the dripping sound into a shallow, stable side passage of the collapsed mine, a narrow space she could just crawl into. The water seeped from a crack in the rock, pure and cold. Using her shovel and bare hands, she dug out a basin in the clay floor of the passage. Over days, she lined it meticulously with more clay, packing it down until it was watertight. The seep filled it slowly, creating a small, clean cistern, a reservoir of fresh water that would never freeze, hidden deep within the rock. The first time she slept inside her completed walls, with a roof of timber and sod above her and the gentle, constant warmth of the rock at her back, was a victory more profound than any she had ever known. Outside, the wind howled its fury, but inside, the air was still and warm. The shelter was crude, ugly, and small, but it was hers. She had built it from nothing. She was still there. After a month of relentless work, she knew she needed more. Shelter was not enough. She needed a sustainable source of food beyond the few rabbits she managed to snare. She needed life in this place of death. That meant a trip back to Promise Creek. Walking back into town was like entering a foreign country. She was leaner, her face weathered by wind and sun, her hands calloused and scarred. Her clothes were stained with mud and pine pitch. The people who saw her stopped and stared. The whispers followed her like a cloud of insects. She ignored them and walked directly to Finch's mercantile. Mr. Finch was counting inventory. He looked up, and his jaw dropped. He had clearly expected her to be dead. "Ilara," he breathed. "By God, you're alive." "I need 2 laying hens," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "A young goat, a nanny if you have one, and as much grain and feed as I can buy with this." She placed the last of her silver dollars on the counter. There were only a few left. Finch stared at the coins, then back at her face. The look of pity was gone, replaced by sheer, dumbfounded confusion. He led her out back to the pens. He sold her 2 healthy hens, a skittish but strong-looking nanny goat, and 3 heavy sacks of feed. As she tied a rope to the goat's collar, Brant the trapper appeared at the corner of the store. He looked at the animals, at Ilara, and let out a loud, braying laugh. "Farming rocks now, are we, Widow Graves?" he called out, for all the town to hear. "What's next? You going to teach them chickens to burrow?" The men with him joined in the laughter. The mockery was open now, a community sport. They had a new name for her. She heard them mutter it as she passed. The Folly Girl. She did not grant them the satisfaction of a reply. She paid Finch, looped the goat's lead over her shoulder, cradled the bewildered chickens in a sack, and began the long, slow walk back to her home. Leading the stubborn goat over the rough terrain was a trial, but the laughter of the townspeople was a fire at her back. Their scorn was a fuel. She would prove them all wrong. Back at the cliff face, she revealed the next part of her plan. She had cleared another side tunnel, one that branched off near her cistern. It was deeper, and the geothermal warmth made the air in it mild and constant, regardless of the temperature outside. Over the course of another week, she performed the most arduous task yet. She hauled soil. Bucket by bucket, sack by sack, she carried nutrient-rich earth from a small, sheltered meadow a quarter-mile away and spread it across the rocky floor of the cavern. She created a garden in the dark. It was a patch of earth, warm and damp, hidden from the sun and the wind and the snow. Here, she planted the few potato eyes and carrot seeds she had brought with her. She built a small, warm pen for the chickens and the goat, deep inside the rock, where their own body heat would add to the ambient warmth. They were safe from predators and the elements. It was during this time that her companion found her. He was a dog, a lanky stray with ribs showing and one torn ear. He was half-starved and wary, drawn by the scent of the goat. He watched her from a distance for days. Ilara left out scraps of food and a bowl of water from her cistern. She did not approach him. She let him come to her. One evening, as a cold rain turned to sleet, he crept into the shelter and lay down by the warm stone, shivering. He looked at her with exhausted, intelligent eyes. She named him Shale. He never left her side again. As autumn bled into winter, the mockery from the town solidified. The name, the Widow's Hole, became her official, unofficial title. It was a story told around the pot-bellied stove in Finch's store, a cautionary tale about a grief-addled woman trying to live in a grave. Brant made a special trip out to her claim one day, ostensibly to check his trap lines. He stood at the edge of her cleared area, Shale growling low in his throat beside Ilara, and surveyed her small, sturdy shelter. "You've been busy," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But that little shack won't survive the first real blizzard. The wind will peel that roof right off, and the snow will bury you. You'll be a frozen corpse by the new year, girl. Mark my words." Ilara simply watched him, her hand resting on Shale's head. She said nothing. Her silence seemed to unnerve him more than any argument would have. He scoffed, turned, and left, whistling to show how little he cared. Soon after, the first snows came. The world turned white, and Alara's isolation became absolute. She was cut off from Promise Creek, a solitary soul living on the edge of the world. But her life was not one of idle survival. It was one of routine and rhythm. Each day was a cycle of essential tasks. She would rise in the dark, the warmth of the granite wall a comforting presence. She would check on the animals, their soft noises a reassurance in the deep quiet. She milked the goat, her hands working by the light of a single tallow lamp. She collected the precious daily egg from her hens. She tended her hidden garden. In the constant, mild warmth of the cavern, the greens grew pale but lush, and the root vegetables swelled in the dark soil. It felt like a miracle, a secret summer she kept hidden from the winter. She chopped firewood, not for primary heat, but for her small cooking fire. She maintained her systems, checking the chinking for drafts, ensuring the cistern remained clear. Her world had shrunk to this small, ordered space. The warm shelter, the life-filled caverns, the silent, white wilderness outside. She was utterly alone, with only Shale for company, but she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of a kingdom carved from stone and defiance. Winter tested her creation with a series of smaller trials. A pack of wolves, lean and desperate, were drawn by the scent of the goat. They circled the shelter for 2 nights, their howls echoing off the cliff face. But her walls were solid logs and stone. The door was thick, barred from the inside. Shale's ferocious barking from within the secure walls convinced the pack to seek easier prey. Another time, a minor avalanche of snow and rock slid down the cliff, triggered by a thaw and refreeze. It piled up against her roof, but the sturdy, well-braced timbers held the weight. Each test, passed and survived, hardened her resolve and deepened her trust in what she had built. Then, in the heart of January, the real test came. It was the blizzard the old-timers would later call the Great Freeze of '83. It did not arrive like a normal storm. It descended like a predator. The sky turned a bruised, malevolent gray. The wind, which had been a constant whisper, began to snarl, then to scream. It was a physical presence, a battering ram that slammed against the wilderness. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring wall of white that erased the world. In Promise Creek, the community's confidence shattered within the first 12 hours. Their conventional, well-built homes were designed for ordinary winters, not for this monster. The wind, funneled down the valley, tore shingles from roofs and shattered window panes. The snow came down with a terrifying weight, piling into drifts that buried doors and windows. The roof of the livery stable collapsed, killing half a dozen horses. Firewood, stacked neatly in woodsheds and against the sides of houses, became inaccessible, buried under 10 feet of impassable snow. Families huddled in their homes, feeding the last of their wood into their stoves, watching the temperature inside plummet. The deep freeze attacked the very foundations of the town. The stone walls of the meeting hall, the pride of the community, cracked with reports as loud as gunshots. Mr. Finch's store, the center of town life, had its large front windows blown in, and a tide of snow and ice consumed his inventory. Promise Creek, once a bastion of frontier certainty, was being dismantled, stick by stick. The town was failing. But inside Alara's shelter there was calm. The blizzard's rage was a distant fury. Her home, built into the cliff, was shielded from the direct assault of the wind, which shrieked and howled far above her. The massive blanket of snow that buried her home was not a threat. It was insulation. It packed against her walls and roof, sealing the last of the tiny drafts, locking the warmth inside. Her heat source was not a dwindling woodpile. It was the inexhaustible warmth of the earth itself, radiating from the granite wall. The fire in her hearth was for cooking, fed by a small, dry stockpile she kept in an interior passage. Her animals were safe and calm in their subterranean pen, oblivious to the storm. Her water, drawn from the deep cistern, was unfrozen and clean. While the world outside descended into a frozen, screaming chaos, Ilara's small, hidden kingdom was an island of warmth, order, and life. She was not fighting the storm. She was living outside its reach. On the third day of the blizzard, when the wind was a solid wall of sound and the world was nothing but white fury, a new sound intruded. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her door. Shale erupted into a frenzy of barking, the sound muffled by the thick wood. Ilara's heart hammered in her chest. No person, no animal should be out in this. It was a death sentence. She grabbed a heavy iron poker, unbarred the door, and pulled it open just enough to see. A figure, more a sculpture of snow and ice than a man, stumbled forward and collapsed into her shelter. It was Brant. The trapper who had mocked her, who had promised she would be a frozen corpse, lay half dead on her floor. His face was a mask of frostbite, his lips blue and cracked. He was gasping, his breath coming in ragged, painful clouds. Ilara slammed the door shut against the storm and dragged him closer to the warm stone. She pulled off his frozen gloves, revealing hands that were waxy and white. She worked quickly, her mind cold and clear. She rubbed his hands and feet with snow to slowly restore circulation, the way she had read in an old almanac. It was a long time before he could speak. He drank the warm goat's milk she gave him in shuddering sips. His eyes, when they finally focused, were filled not with arrogance, but with a hollow, beaten terror. He looked around her shelter, at the steady, smokeless warmth, the neat stack of firewood, the sound of the chickens clucking softly from the cavern. His gaze was one of utter disbelief. My cabin, the drift. The roof came down, he rasped, his voice raw. I thought I was dead. I just walked toward the cliffs. Didn't know where else to go. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw shame in them. The town, he croaked. It's dying. Finch's boy, the youngest, has the lung fever. They're out of wood. Everyone is. The whole town is freezing to death. Ilara stood perfectly still. Here, at her feet, was the man who had laughed at her. He was begging for help on behalf of the town that had cast her out, scorned her, and named her a fool. Every ration of food, every stick of firewood was precious, a carefully calculated part of her own survival. Helping them would put her own life at risk. It would mean depleting the stores she had worked so brutally hard to build. The memory of their laughter, their pity, their condescending certainty, was a bitter taste in her mouth. She looked at Brant's frost-bitten hands. She thought of Mr. Finch's little boy, gasping for breath in a freezing room. The choice was a heavy weight. She could close her door, keep what was hers, and let them face the consequences of their own choices. It would be justice of a kind. But as she looked at the quiet, ordered world she had built, she knew that was not the kind of justice it was made for. She had not built this place out of vengeance. She had built it for life. Without a word, she turned and walked into one of the side passages. She returned with her arms full of dry, seasoned pine. She built up the cooking fire until it crackled, adding precious light and warmth to the room. She ladled out a thick stew of potatoes and salted rabbit into a bowl and pushed it into Brant's trembling hands. The moral choice had been made, not because they deserved it, but because she could. Her action went beyond simple charity. It was a rescue. She showed Brant the small, sturdy sled she had built for hauling firewood. While he ate, she loaded it with a shocking amount of wood from a deep, dry alcove where she kept her main supply. She filled 2 large canteens with fresh water from the cistern. She wrapped a half-dozen precious potatoes and a chunk of goat cheese in a cloth. "The wind is worst in the open," she said, her voice practical, devoid of triumph. "Follow the cliff line. It's longer, but the rock will give you a buffer. It will guide you back to town. Tell them to send 2 men back the same way. I will have more ready." Brant stared at her, then at the loaded sled. He was a trapper, a man who prided himself on his knowledge of survival. What he was seeing defied all of it. He had entered what he thought was a fool's hovel and found an ark. The warmth that filled the room didn't come from the small cooking fire. It came from the very walls. He saw the faint green shoots of her garden peeking from the entrance to the other cavern. He heard the soft bleating of the goat. He could smell the scent of damp earth and life, an impossible aroma in the dead heart of the blizzard. It was a fortress, a secret, thriving world hidden inside a tomb. When he finally left, wrapped in a spare blanket she had given him, he did not offer thanks in words. He couldn't. The shock was too great. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a dawning, terrible understanding of just how wrong he had been. He nodded once, a gesture of profound, humbled respect, and disappeared into the swirling white. Less than 4 hours later they came, 2 figures struggling through the storm, following Brant's tracks along the cliff. It was Mr. Finch and another man from the town council. When Alara opened the door to them, Finch's face was a ruin of grief and shame. He saw Brant's empty bowl. He saw the impossible warmth and order of her home. His eyes welled up. "We called it the widow's hole," he whispered, his voice breaking. He looked from the warm stone wall to the calm, sleeping dog, to Alara's steady, quiet face. "My God," he said, the words torn from him. "We were the fools." Alara did not say, "I told you so." She did not boast. She did not remind them of their mockery or their pity. Her victory was not in their shame, but in her ability to provide. Her grace was a practical, powerful thing. "There is food," she said simply, "and wood. Take what you need for your families. The sled is ready." She fed them, warmed them, and sent them back into the storm with another load of life-saving supplies, becoming the beating heart of the town's survival. When the blizzard finally broke, after 7 days of unrelenting fury, the world was silent and transformed. Promise Creek was a shattered wreck, half buried in snow, but it had survived. Thanks to the steady stream of firewood and food from Alara's shelter, the weakest, including Finch's young son, had pulled through. The townspeople, emerging from their damaged homes, looked north toward the cliffs, not with pity, but with a kind of religious awe. The relationship between Alara and the community was remade. The name "the Widow's Hole" was never spoken again, except in hushed tones of reverence for the woman who had turned a grave into a sanctuary. People no longer offered her charity. They came to trade, to ask for advice, to learn. Mr. Graves, her father-in-law, who had weathered the storm in his large, cold house, barricaded by his wealth but unable to help anyone, found his authority in the town had vanished. His power had been built on conventional wisdom, and the blizzard had proven that wisdom fatally flawed. He was an old man, left behind by a world that had changed overnight. Alara's story spread. Trappers and travelers carried the tale of the Folly Girl, who had tamed the mountain, not by fighting it, but by listening to it. Her methods, once seen as madness, were now recognized as a new kind of wisdom. When Promise Creek rebuilt, it did so differently. New homes were built with deep stone foundations, dug into hillsides to shelter them from the wind. Root cellars were expanded into subterranean storage rooms. The community began to look at the landscape not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner to be understood. Her shelter became a landmark, a testament to what was possible. Years later, Elara stood at the entrance to her home. It was larger now, expanded through the careful excavation of new caverns, with a small, sturdy greenhouse built against the cliff face to capture the winter sun. Shale, now gray around the muzzle, lay sleeping at her feet. She was no longer an outcast, but a respected elder, the quiet, unshakable center of a more resilient town. She looked out at the valley, watching the smoke rise from the chimneys of homes built with the lessons she had taught. She had been given nothing but a place of death and the scorn of her neighbors. From that, she had built not just a shelter, but a life, and in doing so, had rebuilt the future of the entire community. She had learned the frontier's deepest secret, that true strength was not in what you owned or what you conquered, but in the quiet courage to build a world from the things that others had thrown away.